for example, writes an autobiography. He is Muslim and writes it in Arabic. There is the case of Yaro Muhammad, or Muhammad Yaro, who in fact buys his own freedom after 44 years, and by all accounts was practicing Islam when he was free. There are slave tombstones in Georgia which have very decided Islamic markings, and according to the chronicles who then discover this, use the word church facing east to describe places of worship for slaves. Now, of course, they weren't necessarily churches, but the fact that these buildings were designed to face east toward Mecca indicates then that slaves had not completely converted to Christianity, which was a mandate by slave owners for them to do, to be stripped of their Muslim identity, but they were able to then find these liminal spaces in which they were able to practice Islam. There are accounts by descendants of slaves who claim stories that were passed down from elders using what can best be described as prayer rugs or prayer beads. So the culture of Islam was still cases, the actual theology behind it may have become a bit nebulous. There is, of course, the song Levy Camp Holler, which was a work song used as a precursor to the blues. Most musicologists now are of consensus to say that the actual tunes bear the tunes of the Muslim called a prayer, the adhan, or the cadence of Quranic recitation. So these were way going ahead and retaining these fragments of Islamic identity and trying to hold true to them, despite the fact that there was really no theological authority that was in place, and despite the efforts to then go ahead and keep Islam out. Now, when it comes to Islam in America, and especially the definition of what are the parameters of religion in America, I thought that the Treaty of Tripoli of 1796 is one of the most illustrative documents, and perhaps, again, one of the most understudied documents in the United States. Most of you, when you hear the phrase separation of church and state, can trace this down to a letter written by then President Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association, in which he says that there exists a wall between church and state. Now, of course, despite the fact that this was written by an American president, it was simply a letter. It has no binding effects. It wasn't even, dare I say, an executive order. We know how those go. But this was, in fact, an actual treaty, and one that was ratified by the United States unanimously back in 1797, and it was signed into law on June the 10th of 1797. And here's the important clause from this. This was a treaty to the Bay of Tripoli, so a Muslim state. And remember that a few years before, it was Morocco that was the first state to recognize this nascent country, the United States. Article 11 of this treaty says, as the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, meaning Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. This is perhaps the best example of then how the United States perceived itself and its official religiosity. So when it comes to the notion of secularity, when it comes to the notion of religious accommodation, it is in fact the Treaty of Tripoli, which perhaps has more persuasive to it, given the fact that it is a binding treaty, than did some letter by President Thomas Jefferson. Of course, that's not the end of the story, and when it comes to how religions are navigated and negotiated within American civil society, there have been efforts to suppress other religions. And in 1875, perhaps some of the most notorious of these were the Blaine Amendments, where there were efforts made by several states to try to curb funding of Catholic institutions. It got to the point where there was a proposed national amendment to the US Constitution, which would then prevent government funding of Catholic schools. Well, that was something that was unsuccessful, given the difficulties of having an amendment added to the Constitution, having to pass 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures. But it's very telling then to see who is acceptable and what level of religious accommodation is similarly allowed. And particularly when it comes to some of the debates happening today, these then cause a certain level of consternation when it comes to religious minorities of exactly what, when ostensibly a country is not a Christian nation. What does that really mean in its scope and scale, and perhaps more importantly, in its actual application, irrespective of what the laws say? Now, moving forward, when it comes to Muslim Americans and their ability to practice religion, by and large, this hasn't really been a contested issue. And again, as I said, a lot of this has to do with a great debt of gratitude to religious minorities who were able to go ahead and set that path already through an awful lot of sacrifice and through an awful lot of very arduous litigation in order to then test the waters of what really was constitutionally acceptable in America. But there was one very salient constitutional challenge that was made by a rather improbable individual. This gentleman became the light heavyweight champion gold medalist at the 1960 Rome Summer Olympic Games. And then he went on to defeat twice Sonny Liston. This, of course, is Cassius Clay, who then becomes Muhammad Ali. And in 1964, he decided that he was not going to be inducted by the draft in order to go fight in a far-off place called Vietnam. And when he refused to report for his induction ceremony, he was summarily arrested, he was tried, and then he was convicted on a felony charge. Along with that, of course, he lost his license to box. And it's interesting to see what he said in response to this quote. "War is against the teachings of the Holy Quran. I'm not trying to dodge the draft. We are not supposed to take part in no wars unless declared by Allah or the Messenger," unquote. Clearly, he was motivated by his religious sensitivities and sensibilities. And his case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Clay versus the United States in 1971 was decided in his favor with a reversal of his conviction by an 8-0 unanimous decision. Why was it not 9-0? Because Justice Thurgood Marshall had served as Solicitor General in the United States and therefore recused himself because he felt that this could be a potential conflict of interest. Yes, once upon a time, judges were, in fact, self-policing, and if they felt that they were really pushing the envelope. I'm not even sure Marshall was anywhere near the ballpark on this one, but he decided to go ahead and do so. In many ways, when we then consider religious accommodation for and by Muslims, we then have to regard what is the landscape in which they're operating. And perhaps this is the most important issue that we face today, particularly as religious minorities. But I would even regard people who are within the so-called majority currently of America's religious landscape to be facing the same spasms of uncertainty. As we talk about the culture of religion in America, it has been dominated by what we would say is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant paradigm. And of course, that has everything to do with numbers. And every other religious tradition sets its metaphoric clock and calendar to the rhythm of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant schedule. And so how many have had to go ahead and make the accommodation when it comes to an exam, time off from work, conforming to a calendar that somebody else has set, and does so, generally speaking, without too much fanfare, without too much complaint, because it is simply a reality of living in America. But now we find that this is becoming challenged in a much more profound way. And this is concentric circles. It is no longer a matter of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which I would suggest that most religious minorities have adapted to that particular rhythm. But now it is becoming a matter of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant evangelical, and perhaps even more deeply, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant evangelical prosperity gospel. And so as a result of this, how then are religious minorities going to adapt? Is it going to be as simple as asking for accommodations, dispensations, so to speak, when it comes to certain dietary abilities in a dorm cafeteria or in a school cafeteria? I remember when I moved here at the age of 8 from England, I was shocked by the lack of diversity in my school cafeteria. On Fridays, on the menu, it seemed that every single Friday I was going to have to eat a fish sandwich and or macaroni and cheese. I'm like, I always thought that the Americans were a creative, inventive people. Like, come on. And then, of course, after doing some research, I realized, aha, it's because of Catholics and meatless Fridays. I don't recall hearing about some great revolutionary litigation that caused this to happen. It happened in an organic way. Now, of course, there may have been a lawsuit somewhere, but certainly not something that then evoked landmark status at the Supreme Court. This was not going to be, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, School Board of Topeka versus the Filet of Fish. This was something that simply happened because people asked for what they felt the US Constitution would grant them. And we find that in every other situation, whether it is a dispensation for the availability of kashrut food or halal food, a similar trajectory has occurred without the nation falling apart. I was really emboldened today to hear that the US military has passed policy which now allows people of religious faith to have beard, other kinds of facial hair, and even certain apparel that is in accordance to their religious tradition. And I thought, wow, we have come a very long way from 34 years ago, when in 1986, the United States Supreme Court in Goldman v. Weinberger disallowed a Jewish airman from being able to wear a yarmulke as part of his uniform. So somehow or the other, the military has caught up to the idea that a yarmulke is not going to disqualify somebody from being a Top Gun. When we see then the arc of Muslim involvement in the United States as it comes to accommodation, I can think of no example where Muslims have necessarily asked for or requested something that has not already been granted to some religion prior, whether it is in the area of dietary accommodation, whether it is in exemptions for religious holidays, whether it is in workplace or school accommodations when it comes to apparel, or when it comes to any kind of other access to religious needs. We are simply treading on already well-trodden ground and territory. The idea that Muslims are somehow the other seeking to implement or apply or allow for Sharia law to become the law of the land is rather specious, because as I mentioned before, all of those aspects of Islamic law which they would want to practice already exist. And it's always interesting to hear that perhaps there are some things that are so central to Islam and to Muslims practicing their religion that they're simply clamoring, either sitting inside the proverbial Trojan horse or just simply biding their time to go ahead and create, like polygamy. Yeah, that's not really happening. There's the occasional joke about it on some of my WhatsApp groups, but when somebody's wife rifles through their phone, that message magically disappears. So I'm not sure then if those kinds of quote-unquote religious accommodations really carry the kind of provenance to how Muslims see themselves. But I want to end on one point when it comes to what the broader American society and the legal system has in mind for the deference to Muslim Americans and how they practice their religion. And Howie mentioned this idea about self-policing. I always tell my students that there is a difference between law and ethics. Law tends to be defined as a way to regulate society, and ethics is what regulates the individual. And we find then that Muslim Americans are quite conscious and conscientious of the fact that they live in a legal system where at the same time they may not necessarily be custodians of the authority apparatus, but as citizens, they are certainly stakeholders in maintaining and adhering the broader fidelity and integrity of the constitutional system. So as a result of that, it is of course important for them to recognize that they are very much part of that legal process. And I think about in 2013, in the aftermath of the horrific Boston Marathon bombing, there was an incident that happened in Boston when it came to one of the two killers. This would be Tamerlane Tsarnaev, the one who was in fact gunned down. It was the Islamic Center of Boston that made the decision to say that we will not perform the funeral rites over Tsarnaev's body. They refused to do so. They disavowed themselves of that, which of course on the one hand and on the surface would seem to be quite antithetical. That is it really for the community to go ahead and judge whether somebody, irrespective of what atrocity they committed, should be deprived of a religious ritual from occurring. But yet, this was a decision that was made, quote unquote, in-house. It was adhered to, and it was something that certainly was not going to be challenged by the United States. As such, we find then that these examples of how religion is navigated by Muslims in America is always going to be done by an ad hoc basis. The idea that they certainly are empowered and in some cases encumbered to exercise religion in the way that they see fit is part of a longer historical arc that we find even with the Ottoman Empire. When Howie was describing the idea about how members of the Jewish diaspora were in some cases deputized or given the authority to go ahead and make those decisions of halakha on their own, one such scenario was in the Ottoman Empire where the millet system allowed for religious minorities to go ahead and have full authority over matters of so-called personal law. At the same time, they were encumbered upon recognizing and adhering to the broader legal system, particularly in matters that were interreligious in nature. Having, for example, a member of the Jewish community and a commercial dispute with somebody from, say, the Coptic community in Egypt, that would then be presided over by the broader Ottoman system, which was rather sophisticated. But in-house, these were matters for the housekeepers to keep in mind. It seems as though this is a system that is working in the United States, where we have a kind of de facto millet system. By and large, we do not have state encroachment on deciding when Eid should be, except it might be a hell of a lot easier than deciding on one of 3 different days if somebody goes ahead and makes that call for us. Encroachment one way or the be less a matter of theology of Islam, American civil religion.
Interesting lecture. Well, thank God for freedom of religion. And I think we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, please, if the speakers could join us. Please direct your question to either speaker.
Yes. You want me to follow up on the question that you had? Yeah. Okay. So the question, just so that everyone else can hear it, is that, let me see if I can paraphrase as best as I can what you said. Islam is a beautiful religion, but there are still extremists. Why does it seem as though Arab states do not come out more strongly and condemn this to then perhaps dissuade the extremists from being, well, extreme? That's actually something that has been condemned in many different manifestations. But as a lot of scholars will go ahead and attest, What we find when it comes to the process of radicalization and extremism is actually that they reside external to respecting and acknowledging the authorities that actually do make these condemnations. And this is one of the great dilemmas that happens, that if there is a democratization of authority, then all bets are off. And what we find then is it's very easy through the lens of opportunism for somebody to find somebody who will validate the views that they do. If it was done from the other end, or what's called a priori, then there's really no problem. If you presume that the authority is the binding authority over you, and that you will accept the edict or the pronouncement that they make, even if you don't agree with it yourself, and that you will self-enforce, that then is going to be the antidote toward extremism and radicalization. But if you feel as though your level of authority is that of, say, an imam, and that anybody can go ahead and open up the text, interpret it their way, especially if they already have a presumption that they want to validate, that's where you find then the problem of extremism.
Okay, and also, I'm sorry, and also for Sharia law, are we still practicing Sharia law as far as adultery for and not forced, but you're gonna marry so-and-so and.
Well, those are two different things. Adultery and arranged marriage are two different things.
Are they still doing it?
So who's they?
Are you, not really, well,
Are you saying like in Muslim states?
Yes.
So, okay, so there's two things. One, let me take each of them. The notion of arranged marriage is actually a cultural practice. Okay, and that I'm not going to say doesn't occur. I'm also not going to say that it is confined to just Muslim states. I'm not even going to say that it's confined to non-European and non-Western states. The other issue, of course, is adultery, and I'm presuming you mean whether the punishment for adultery is a capital punishment. Right. It does occur in some places, not going to lie, but as far as if you see this as a rampant epidemic and a universal application capital offense, the answer is no. So, and by the way, adultery was a capital offense at common law in the West as well.
Okay, if I have this right, and you correct me if I'm wrong. I will. Yeah, we've known each other a long time, you will. Okay, halacha, right path. Sharia, going towards water, which I mean, so that soon means right path. Okay, having to do with proselytizing, is that part of the right path in Islam? Because it is not in Judaism as far as I know. I'm already in trouble.
Okay, well, no, you said was mostly right. First of all, what's that? Oh, the question was, first you said, I'll go question on that. Halakha doesn't mean the right path, it simply means the path. Okay? It's really, orthodoxy means the straight path. That means, and that's different. Then you asked about proselytizing in Islam and in Judaism.
No, wait, I said that his was the path towards the water.
Yeah, he'll tell you about that. Okay, then you asked the question about the notion of proselytizing, and that Jews don't proselytize. Turns out that until a specific moment, is that what you said?
No, what I said, it isn't part of our righteous path, so to speak.
Well, it used to be that. Jews proselytized actively and aggressively until a particular moment in time, the 300s, and just until it became dangerous to do so. Not only did Jews proselytize for several hundred years, Jews were really good at proselytizing, and they stepped away from it. What's interesting is that, and they did it for reasons of absence of a sense of security. In the 20th century, as Jews have become more secure with the embarrassment of riches of having the state of Israel in the United States, now we do see the beginnings of a little bit more of Jewish proselytizing. Not as aggressively as it once was, but the frowning on it or the absolute refusal to do it doesn't exist as much as it used to be. So it was situational, it wasn't halachic.
So Christianity and Islam are both proselytizing faiths. It's probably for that reason that there's no coincidence that they're the two largest faiths on earth. Because otherwise the notion of how people learn about it would be somewhat more muddled. At the same time, the word proselytization has a very negative connotation today. It's seen as synonymous with used car salesmen, or by a certain level of imposition, that somebody is talking about religion, and certainly within a kind of more post-Enlightenment modern frame, that's one of two topics that people find to be a little bit, how could I put this, unkosher to talk about, the other being politics. But otherwise, the notion of people sharing their religious ideas and maybe providing more of an insight and maybe even a nudge would not have been seen as untoward or unparliamentary maybe even 100, 150 years ago. This was seen as perfectly natural. But how proselytization occurs, it also varies. Does it have to be communicative? Does it have to be verbal communication? Can it just simply be proselytization ontologically, just sort of providing an example? These are open questions. Now, of course, those who feel as though there is an imperative to proselytize will go ahead and take perhaps the easiest path of saying, well, verbally proselytizing, that way I know that's proselytization. But is just simply providing an example, one's behavior, one's conduct, is that enough? I mean, and these are huge questions. I'll give you an example. I had a 62-year-old student, what we call on campus a non-traditional student. He was an investigative journalist and a lawyer by trade. He was 6'5", he had a shock of silver hair, and one day he tells me, he says, yeah, I want to accept Islam. I'm like, no, you don't. And he says, no, you know what? You have inspired me. And I'm like, then you really don't. As you can tell, I'm the world's greatest proselytizer. And by the way, as some of you may know, that it is said according to Islamic tradition that if somebody accepts Islam because of you, you have a real shot at paradise. Yeah, thanks for the cough. I don't know if that was on cue, but it worked well. So I actually tried to dissuade him. I said, no, you know what? Why don't you go back and do some more reading? The problem is the guy had read most of even what's on my bookshelves. So he was definitely coming at it not because of, I asked him first, I said, is this because of a girl? And he said, no. And I said, I don't think it's for a green card either. And he says, no. And so then finally he's really got the itch. And he says, okay, I want to take the Shahada. I said, okay, you know the lingo. And I said, I'll tell you what, why don't you wait about 3 months? And he said, why should I wait? I said, because Ramadan is coming, and it's coming right smack in the middle of the summer. And if you convert after, you don't have to fast the 17-hour fast. And he's like, what kind of Muslim are you? Yeah, I am that other sect of Islam, the pragmatic sect. And so then he said, okay, whatever. He couldn't wait. So he goes to his local mosque up in Saginaw. And he goes and he talks to the Imam. And he says, Imam, I want to take the Shahada. And the Imam says, mashallah, praise be to God. Why don't you come in 3 weeks? And he says, I mean, are you really that busy? I mean, I heard it was easy. He says, no, Ramadan will be over by then, and this way you don't have to fast. I'm like, see, we know what's going on. Now, is that proselytization? Do I get credit for that? God knows best.
hijabs, with long dresses, others who wear hijabs and slacks, others who, like Ruby, like your wife, wears a scarf loosely over her hair, but you can see her hair, also wears slacks and things like that. And there are Muslim women in the group who you would never think were Muslim. If you saw them at Somerset, they could be from West Bloomfield and be Jewish. You don't have, no, seriously, are there officially different degrees in Islam, like there is Reform Orthodox, Conservative? And even in this mosque, I know different people who belong here and who dress differently, and I'm kind of wondering how does Islam see that at this stage? Is it official, or is it just kind of a casual thing?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, this whole question about the diversity within Islam and how codified is it. So first of all, let me address the fact that you mentioned Ruby and how she dresses. And I'm not a fashionista, and I'm certainly not a fashion police. And luckily, she doesn't tell me how to dress. She gave up. You're going to find that, first of all, there are going to be a multitude of variations when it comes down to how the interpretation is of a single tenet of Islam, and that is modesty. So there is this notion that believing people should be modest. And by the way, it doesn't just extend to women, it is also men. The idea of covering. To what degree that comes down to a matter of interpretation, what is seen as perhaps more traditional, or to use another word that has been used here, orthodox, is going to perhaps cover more. There's a difference, though, between orthodoxy, meaning a particular expression of the doctrine, and orthopraxy, meaning the practice. And in Islam, you do not necessarily have as much orthopraxy as even some Muslims might think there is. And so that's why you're going to find really running the whole gamut on this particular issue. And in many ways, that also extends to other things. Keeping kosher, for example, whether they eat strictly zabiha or halal or not, and even what does that mean? Some say it's just the manner in which the animal is dispatched. Some will say, I hope that the animal was treated ethically while it was alive, even free range. So you find even these interpretations now starting to come in. And the last thing that you were asking is about whether there is a similar gradation of orthodox, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, humanist. I suppose we can throw that in just to make an even five. Not institutionally and not formally. But I would suggest that most Muslims in a particular area know the particular ideological rudder of a mosque. And so while you're probably not going to find in America the first Reform Mosque of Bloomfield Hills and the third conservative Islamic center of Troy, people know, because they know the quality of the imam, they know the kind of direction, the ethos of the place, what they are. And they will then make their choices accordingly when it comes to the programming.
Are there examples where Sunni and Shia communities, not nations, communities, put together in their honor reconciliation?
Yeah, sure. So the question is examples of Sunni and Shi'i, the two major denominations of Islam where the communities live harmoniously. Yeah, here. I mean, not to be too flippant, you're going to find, though, that, I mean, when there are issues that people take their denominational identity as being a fractious issue, that there's going to be tensions. And particularly when you find what's happening in some parts of the Middle East today, where the issue is being framed as one of sectarianism, then you're going to find that those people who embrace it and internalize it will similarly go ahead and have issues. But nothing to the point where it is so venomous or so discordant that people are at loggerheads. In 2006, when there were a couple of mosques in Iraq of tremendous historical significance that were bombed, those that had the tombs of the 10th and the 11th imams, very venerated within Shi'i Islam. A journalist from Chicago came here, from a major national news network, which rhymes with box, and wanted to interview me for whether or not, and this was the premise, that there was going to be a civil war on the streets of Dearborn between Sunni and Shi'i because of what was happening in Iraq. And I said, well, you don't understand, Detroiters. We riot when our sports teams win. It's not because of sectarianism. And I said that these are communities that have had to deal with the unfortunate situation of the Lebanese Civil War, which was a function of confessional politics. Somehow or the other, they managed to make it through from 1975 to 1990, and in all other manifestations of these things. I said, it's a community that is, you have to give a little bit more credit. An hour and a half half of interview, all of it on the cutting room floor. It just simply wasn't juicy enough.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Imam Almasmari please to give us his remarks and give us a closing prayer.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank you all. You put me on the spot. Thank you, Dr. Khalidi, for your leadership. Thank MMCC, AJC, JCRC, and our amazing professors. I always enjoy these sessions. It's a session of growth, intellectual growth, and they have so much to offer. So give them a round of applause. And thank you for coming. And we hope to see you in the next two sessions. I thought it was there, but I hope that the flyer, you can see in the flyer. And again, thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
The next lecture will be on the 19th of February at Betham. You're all invited. Please join us. Thank you.
Okay, do it here. Great for tuning in. Learned a lot. I've been coming to this event for years. Great local professors, good information, history. Know the facts, learn from the experts. It's the head of departments of Judeo and Arabic Islamic Studies at the Wayne State University, and just a sign of peace and brotherhood. First event in the mosque, second event in the synagogue, third event at the university. Been doing this for years. So have a great night, everybody. Take care.